Thank you all for coming. I know it's getting a little bit tiring. End of day 2, almost time for beer, almost time for dinner. I'm actually having a great time. It's my first time at PGCon, now PGConf.dev. But many of you have been to this conference in its previous incarnation, right? Show of hands? Most of you. Okay, cool. Well, I was really excited when this talk was accepted. And I think because I've had such positive experiences working with the team, the Postgres contributor team, and previously the Citus team on their blogs, and how to increase the impact and how to make them more accessible to more readers, so that more people can understand whatever the heck we are trying to explain to them. So here we go. Let's dive in. Let's see if I can get this to work right. So my background, for those of you who don't know, I started off life as a software engineer at Sun Microsystems, back when Sun Microsystems was still a thing. And I worked in developer tools. Small story, I met my husband in developer tools, so then I'm like, okay, I don't want to be in the same part of the company as him. So I moved over into operating systems, and that kind of changed the trajectory of my career. And I spent over the next 10 years working in the kernel group at Sun. And then at one point, I was chartered to lead the effort to open source Solaris. And then I got moved into product marketing and product management, and that's kind of where I've been ever since. Although now my role at Microsoft is more around community building. So that's just to give context over the fact that my skill set is a combination of engineering as well as product management, product marketing, thinking about how to communicate with people. And so I try to blend those two skills together and then share some of that with all of you. And the way I got involved in Postgres was because of this small startup called Citus that I worked at for about 2 years before we got acquired. So that was kind of the start. Somebody said this. And I don't know who said it's not just open source, it's open engineering in description of Postgres. Does anyone know who the source of this quote is? I think I heard it from Peter Eisentraut, but I'm not sure he was the source. I feel like he was quoting somebody at the time. But that was also part of the inspiration for this talk. Like, okay, let's share how it is that we do what we do with blogging. There are lots of dog illustrations in the talk, and that is Zuka. She is my family's second chocolate Labrador, and I will just warn you, chocolate Labradors are crazy. They're just full of piss and vinegar, and she is very excitable. She's well trained, but like just a very exuberant dog. So anyway, this is her one cameo in the talk. So the talk will have 2 parts, what you write and then where you send it. And to put those in marketing terms, like we're talking about content and we're talking about distribution. And first, I want to start with content, and let's dive in. I think when you are starting off writing a blog, your frame of mind is kind of important, like the perspective that you bring when you're writing. So I always try to have a specific reader in mind so that my language is not what they taught me in school. In school, I was taught to write very formally, passive voice was okay for some reason, just to write in these long, complex sentence structures. And instead, I try to think about a specific person, what I want them to read, and I want to write to that person. And I'll talk later about how being conversational is helpful. And then this was written for a slightly different audience at FOSDEM, but I think a lot of times some of you are working on new features that you want people to understand, right? So a lot of the talks here, your talk, Thomas, yesterday about streaming I/O and vectored I/O, not everybody was involved in the development of that, and you want other people to understand kind of how it works, why you did what you did. So I would imagine that the Hackers mailing list is a great source. The work that you're doing is a great source. But sometimes another way to think about what you should be writing about is, what's that question that you've gotten 10 times in the last 6 months? Maybe you should write a blog post about it instead of answering the same question over and over and over again. The most important thing I want to share is empathy. That is the thing that it's very easy not to have. When you're sleep deprived, when your spouse or partner needs something, if you have kids or dogs and they need something, you have a lot of commitments that you're trying to deliver on. It's really easy to want to just get the darn thing done. and get the blog written and not really focus as much on who it is that you're writing to and how you can make it easier for them to understand, how you can make it more accessible to like different types of brains, if you will. Like, how many of you would say you are a visual learner? Anybody? A couple? How many of you would say you learn really well just by reading text, reading words? Okay. And there's all these different types of learning, and what we've found, and I'll talk about this later as well, is that having different formats that appeal to those different brains, like making sure there's a diagram and not just text, perhaps putting numbers in a table and not in really long, complicated sentences, like all the things that you probably do a lot already, but it's really easy when you're trying to get a blog out to kind of skip those steps, those different ways. I love this cartoon just because a lot of people misunderstand empathy, right? And they think of it as sympathy, and so sympathy is, I'm sorry that you're in pain. But empathy is truly feeling it, really standing in that person's kind of wet, sweaty shoes and getting a feel for how maybe what you're writing is going to cause them to have to reread stuff 3 or 4 times in a row. And that's kind of not nice. It's kind of selfish. You can get the blog written faster that way, and then the hundreds or potentially thousands of people who read your blog post have to suffer through and reread to try to understand it. So empathy is the true north that I use and a lot of my teammates use when we're working on blog posts. And it also means this empathy for the fact that people are busy and they're in a hurry too. So not only do you want to make things clear, but maybe you want to make things easy to digest. So I grabbed this from, I don't know, How Mechanical Rubber Goods Are Made, February 2014, some kind of source. But sometimes people write in really long, chunky paragraphs that are and there's like 5 main points in each paragraph. And so my rule is my paragraphs should be short, and there should only be 1 main point in any one of them. And don't do this. Don't make people suffer through really complex prose in blog posts. So scannability is kind of the #1 way that you can show empathy or have empathy for your readers. And what that means is having, how many of you drink coffee? Did any of you go to a coffee shop this morning, or did you all drink the coffee here? Okay, well, before we all got our news on these things, right, they used to have newspapers right up when you're waiting in line for the coffee, and there were all these headlines, and I used to always find myself reading the headlines. And so when I write a blog post, I try to make sure each section of the blog post has a section headline. And we'll talk about that in a second. But other things can be super useful for scannability, like bullets. I can't tell you how often we'll look at a blog post and there'll be a whole bunch of things in a paragraph. And I'm like, oh, that should just be 4 bullets. And it's so much faster to read. So these are all things that we just do during the edit cycle. The other thing about bullets is if each bullet is if I go backwards, each bullet is a big, big, chunky paragraph, it's hard to scan all of a sudden, even though it's a bullet. And so we will often just create a bold font prefix at the beginning of that bullet that tells you what it's about. So all somebody has to do is read the 4 bullets in the bold font. They don't have to read the rest of it unless they are interested, which they aren't always. So H2 section headers, I'm just going to give you a couple examples. For this internal document that I wrote, which is like our blogging best practices, people told me, yeah, this is great in theory, but I want examples. And they wanted them to be scannable and short and easy to digest and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know. This is from a real blog where the section headline was example, which is fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, except it's so much more useful to say a real world example. It's about a multi-tenant to-do application. It's just more descriptive. It's more helpful to the reader who's only going to read the section headlines to decide if they're going to read any more in the blog post. So another example is, I don't remember whose blog post this was, could have been Yelta's, and the section headline was PG Bouncer. And then it got changed to how to set up PG Bouncer, our preferred connection pooler, right? And then conclusion is the classic. It's really hard to summarize the main takeaway of a conclusion at the end of the blog post. You're usually tired by the time you're writing the conclusion. You're exhausted. You just want the darn thing done. But in this was, I think, one of Samai's blog posts. And we turned that into a cheat sheet for tuning Postgres auto vacuum. And then we probably added a diagram or something to the conclusion, as well as next steps. The other thing is don't just make these section headlines big font that's bold. Like they should be H2s in terms of styling, because that affects how screen readers work. So people who are visually impaired and use screen readers in order to understand whatever it is they're consuming, like the fact that it is an H2 makes a big difference for them. So I already talked about how people's brains process information differently. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. But another way you can show empathy is this variety of formats. So diagrams, tables, screenshots, code blocks. So how many of you do this today? How many of you feel like in your blogs you already use a variety of formats? Cool, so a handful of you. How many of you blog today? Let's ask that. Also just a handful? Okay, I know more of you blog. I know you blog, just not in a while, right? But maybe soon, maybe? I don't know. What? You have a lot to write about, right? You could just take your talk from yesterday and turn it into a blog post. Maybe when we get the recording, we can just take the transcript and turn it into something. Okay, so in terms of diagrams, I grabbed a screenshot of one of David Rowley's blog posts from Postgres 15. And I don't know if any of you saw this when it came out. It was a while ago. But the diagram just helped so much in telling the story that he was trying to tell with words. That classic, like a picture speaks 1,000 words, is true even for people who aren't spatial learners. And he actually put a little bit of thought into this. Like originally the diagram looked different, and it's been over 1.5 years now, so I can't remember, but I do remember it was not this good. It was close, but he made it easier and easier to understand. And the other thing that we did when uploading diagrams and things into the blog post is making sure to put alt text in for them. And again, that is that empathy for people who are using screen readers, who are visually impaired, and it's an easy thing to do. It takes just an extra 20 seconds to create. So that is, if you go check that blog post out, there is alt text for every single one. Yes?
So alt text, should we think about the screen reader as the consumer or the tooltip as the consumer?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think about the person as the consumer. So one of the things that a lot of times people will do is they'll say, this is a chart of Postgres performance comparing record sizes or something like that. And instead, I also try to describe it visually. This is a horizontal bar chart, using colors to distinguish between Postgres 14 and Postgres 15. I describe it the way I would if I was actually sitting next to that blind person and they were trying to understand not just what it's about, but kind of sort of what it looks like. I'm not sure I answered your question though.
No, it does. It's like you could have Postgres 14 be Postgres 15, the title as the alt text, but that doesn't really tell you what the picture says. And what you describe is a description of what you'd be looking at if you could see.
Yes.
I still don't think, to me, it'd be like diagram showing how Postgres 15 is so much percent faster than Postgres 14 on average over so that you could summarize.
And that is absolutely debatable. What's the best description for a visually impaired person to understand the graphic? We would probably both describe it differently, and that's okay. But the point is to describe it and not leave that field empty, right? A third way, another question? Oh, that's a good idea. I'm not sure if you could hear that on video, but the suggestion was a good way to design alt text is to turn off the image displays and then figure out if the blog still makes sense without it and what you have to put there in place of the image. All right, the third way to show empathy is readability. So how many of you have ever used this thing called the Hemingway app? I know a lot of people who speak really highly about it. My issue has always been I use a lot of em dashes in my writing. I am a big em dash person, and it doesn't handle em dashes very well. So it always says that my writing is a little bit more complicated than I think it really is. But if you don't, it's a really good thing to use, at least for a while. Maybe that while is 3 months or 6 months or 12 months, depending on how often you might write a blog. just a way to check and see, is my writing style coming out at the 18th grade level? Because the target is the 3rd or the 5th grade level. If you want your blog to be shared and read broadly, you got to write it really simply. And that means, not using really formal, complex sentence structures. Here it's highlighting the word utilize instead of use. It's like, I think it wants you to throw away adverbs. It's useful, and it's recommended by a lot of people. One of my goals, by the way, for today is to just give you tips that are useful. And I like that some of you are asking questions along the way, because this is a smallish group, and so we can talk about it. I don't just want this to be a lecture. More on readability. So the style that we've always used and that I've always used is conversational. So I try to write in the second person, write to you. I can't believe you brought that skateboard all the way from New Zealand, right? To make it really personal. And so I just, put boxes around the yous there to kind of drive that point home in that example. But if some people's, not everybody's, people's brains are different, but for quite a number of people, their brains are wired for conversation. And so if you make it conversational, if you make it be the way that you speak, you're going to probably get more people reading it and understanding it. So, and sometimes I literally have to envision like that young niece or young nephew just starting out, and I'm over coffee with them, and how would I explain this to them? Somebody I care about, but someone who's not an expert yet. How would I explain it to that important person to me? And that helps me at least put in the effort and change my voice and change how I describe it. I think the thing that's easy to do, I won't say wrong, but it's really easy to write for experts like yourselves, right? And write a great blog. Thomas can write a great blog that Andres will completely understand super quickly. But does that mean that a college student studying physics who wants to get into Postgres is going to understand it? I'm pointing over there. Sorry. But, and that's a challenge, is try to appeal to both audiences without, you just have to try to appeal to both audiences. So I put checklists in here. My slides will get published up on SpeakerDeck later this afternoon or tonight, so if they're useful for anybody. But these are the checklists that I pay attention to when I'm reviewing a blog post or writing a blog post. And I don't always have tables. I don't always have code blocks. You don't always have all of these components. But if you find yourself writing a blog post that is just prose and just really thick paragraphs and doesn't have section headlines and doesn't have any of these things, then it's probably not going to get a lot of views, and it's probably not going to change a lot of people's lives. So does anyone disagree? Or is this all kind of common sense? Hopefully. And even when things are common sense for me, I still need checklists. Because I'm busy, I'm stressed, I got a lot going on, and checklists kind of help keep me grounded. It's just like having a packing list. The one time I was going sailing in Greece and I didn't use my darn packing list, I forgot 6 things. I forgot the little things that you attach to your glasses so that you don't lose them in the sea. That's a very important thing, and it's like the first thing I had to go buy when I landed in Athens. So I think checklists are really, really valuable. In fact, there's a great book called The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. Have any of you read it? Did you love it? Did you love it? Okay, it's an amazing book that canvasses people in 4 different industries. So he's a doctor. So one industry was doctors, another was construction, another one was airline pilots. And it turns out that the number one thing on the checklist for what you should do wrong in an emergency if you're piloting a plane, the number one thing is, do you remember it? Fly the plane. Because, if you get caught up in trying to diagnose and deal with issues, all of a sudden the plane's... So fly the plane is number 1 on that list. Anyway, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the edit cycle. I think the first thing, and this is interesting for me, when I'm working with someone who's a first-time blogger, sometimes, again, they just want to get it done. They feel like they have a million things to do, and if that first draft doesn't get all green check marks and gold stars, they might feel bad about it. And what I often try to explain to them is that, the whole process of writing is editing. Editing is part of the process, and you've got to just embrace the iterative aspect of it. I love this. I don't know if you can read the text on David Perel's tweet here, but Writing is the process of following thought trails, hitting a dead end, going back, finding new thought trails, and repeating the same pattern over and over again until you've written something good. Now, Andres, does that sound similar to you, to like maybe the process of developing async I/O?
I don't know specifically that. Generally, it's very similar to developing any non-trivial feature.
Yeah. So, but people who maybe are not developers or are early in their career as developers, maybe they haven't internalized that yet. So sometimes they'll be like really frustrated. And so I just try to coach them to embrace the iteration and just go with it. Know that it's part of it. Know that it's the only way you're going to get to this positive, really effective end result. So the other thing, and a lot of people have said this, I think Ernest Hemingway said this, probably Stephen King said this, I don't know. It is totally okay for your first draft to suck. Like every first draft I create sucks. And not only am I okay with that, I'm okay sharing it. Now, I'm okay being judged by it. And I'll just tell people, look, it's a first draft. It's okay for it to suck. But that's the other thing that can happen with some people. They don't share it. They don't share it. They don't share it because they feel like the first thing they share needs to be really, really high quality. But you got to get feedback from people and other ideas that might cause you to have to pivot or completely throw out a section and add something new. So just embrace the fact that first drafts are allowed to be bad. Agree? Disagree? You raised your eyebrows. Okay. So what's interesting about this screenshot that I really liked is artists totally get this. And they will scumble sketches and drawings, some of which they will never share, but it helps them think through their ideas. And so they embrace the fact that the first things that I love the word scumble, S-C-U-M-B-O-L. The first thing that they scumble may not be anything like the final result, but it's their way of exploring their way through the thought process. Yes?
I just wanted to say that reminds me of patches.
How so? Scumbling reminds you of patches? Like
Well, yes,
these pictures?
I just meant the first draft often suck. But some people,
Can you use the microphone for the video,
I
please?
just wanted to say on the Postgres mailing list where we send, patches and changes to Postgres or whatever, people seem to have very different approaches to how readily they'll share early stage stuff that might be half broken or but it demonstrates some concept or whatever. Whereas other people seem to try and get something perfect. It's just something I've noticed. You're thinking reminded me of that.
And I'm a little torn about it too, because sometimes you feel like I don't want to waste people's time with something that's half-baked.
Yeah.
But then you can position it as, I know this is half-baked, but look at this part of it.
Yeah.
And just help me assess, is this going in the right direction?
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah, I think there's a lot of correlations to development. And part of that is back to like my bio in the beginning. Spent the first 16 years of my career in engineering. And there are people who are not from an engineering background who sometimes come to me and say, yeah, all these blogging best practices, this is good enough. And they have this kind of good enough attitude. And I'm always torn. Like maybe they're right. Perfect is the enemy of the good, right? I believe that. If you wait for something to be perfect, you'll never ship it, right? But on the other hand, I don't know. I do approach the blogging that I do with the same rigor that my engineers used to approach code reviews. And it's just in my DNA, I guess. And it's always a tension of like how much is too much. Andres and I have talked about that a bunch too. Okay, so feedback is a gift. Not everybody is a good reviewer. So when you go to get 2 or 3 reviews, if someone just says, oh yeah, looks great. I found a typo in the 3rd paragraph, but other than that, you're good. You probably don't want that person to review your blogs again in the future because it's probably not that good, right? So okay, we can debate it. But I do think there are people who look for what might be missing. And I think that's an incredibly valuable thing. There are people who look for what might be boring or what might be confusing. And I think, again, that's valuable. Now, what I do is I specifically ask people for that. So I make it easy for people to help me. So I'll ask them just 4 things. Flag what's confusing. Flag when your mind started to wander and you decided to go make toast. Then that's probably a section I need to improve. What was boring? If there's something that you thought was spot on gold and then I need to keep no matter what, and then just random ideas, things that might be missing. And that's and I won't necessarily ask everybody to do all 4 of those things. I might ask Thomas to just focus on the first 2 or something like that. All right, So then there's this really, how many of you read or are fans of Stephen King, his writing? Okay, so he wrote a really good book called On Writing. Did you read that? What's cool about the book is it's not just about writing. It's also this semi-autobiographical book about a time in his life when he got hit by a car and he almost died and kind of how he worked his way through it. And so it's a neat mixture. But there's a quote, and I think it's in that book, which is kill your darlings, even when it breaks your egocentric little scribbler's heart. I just had to say that out loud. But I always think about it as just getting your scissors out and being willing to cut and being willing to throw things away. Now, I have a very hard time with that. So my cheat is I just push things through, like I have a section at the bottom of my draft, cutting room floor, and I just push things down there. They're still there. I can change my mind. I can go back and reuse them and repurpose them. I never do. But it's the only psychological way I can kill my darlings, if you will. So leave them on the floor. So this is actually an example that's several years old now from Andres of a blog draft that he first started circulating. And we can debate whether the blog draft was all 3 of these or 2 of these. I feel like the original draft encompassed all 3, and we split it. Well, he split it into 3 different parts because it was just too big and too long. And so forking that draft into shorter posts, I think made them each more accessible. And they each separately hit front page Hacker News. So that was kind of, it had a dramatic increase in the reach, right? Because on any particular day, people are only maybe paying attention. So there's probably very few, I don't know, do you feel like people read all 3 of them? I feel like, who's to say? We don't know. But we know they were spanned out over time. So if someone was on vacation one week and missed one of these, well, maybe they were around for the other ones. So we will sometimes fork something to be shorter. The other piece, okay, shorter as in not as long as it was. How's that? Yeah, one of those posts in particular was still quite long. If only it were simple to keep things simple. But this is something that I try to do. So my husband will always say, analogy is the weakest form of argument. And I'm like, well, maybe, but when I'm explaining something to someone, if I use an analogy that puts this new concept into a mental model that they already have, that can be super helpful. It's like a cheat, it's a hack, it's a shortcut. And so I do try to do that sometimes in writing when you're trying to explain a concept. And then you can footnote how it's different or how it's slightly wrong or whatever, but you're trying to help people understand. So the other interesting thing is move details into footnotes. I didn't used to be a footnotes fan till I met Andres. And he's a footnotes fan. No, you have footnotes in everything you write. You put these little footnotes with all these details. Did you not know that? Okay, he does. So then I had to learn the HTML to work around a bug so I could properly footnote things, and now I use them a little bit more than I used to. Okay, reading it out loud. So how many of you, if you are working on a blog, will read it out loud to yourself before you publish? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Is it useful to you? Do you find mistakes? It's amazing how the brain will fix problems if you just read it in your head. You will not even notice typos, errors, repeated words, all sorts of mistakes. But not only just mistakes, like sometimes you read it out loud and you think, damn, I would never say that. That sounds so pompous, or that sounds so arrogant, or that sounds so condescending, or whatever tone of voice it has that you did not intend. So I find it's a really good way to assess if it's conversational and if it's friendly, useful. So reading it out loud. When people send me stuff and it's full of typos and mistakes and repeated words and whatever, like I can just tell they did not read it out loud because there's no way they would have missed those things. Okay, so optimize for SEO is a little tricky as another tip in this part of the talk. And it's a little tricky because Google is, and probably the other search engines are changing, right? They're changing their algorithms because of AI. And I don't have this all dialed right now. So this is not optimized to reflect like how Google is going to be doing search results and doing SEO into the future. This is my perspective today, and I know my perspective needs to get smarter and more informed. So, I think some of the things I'm going to share with you here, I believe they will still be true. And they will still be useful. And the first is that good content is paramount. Like if you're writing something and it's useful to people and it solves problems or answers questions, then it's probably going to do well on SEO if you do a couple other smart things. And one of them is really pay attention to your title, because the title, at least historically until now, has had a big effect on the discoverability of your blog post and where it shows up in search results. And so what do I mean? Like, it's not just discoverability, it's also clickability. Like, if I see that title, does it sound boring? Or does it sound interesting? Am I gonna click on it? Or am I gonna just keep on going because I have a lot to do? So here's an example of a recent blog that I worked on with David Rowley, and it was about the Postgres 16 query planner. And you could see that all of these different title options that we kind of brainstormed on together are variations of the same thing. But there are some kind of fundamentally different things here too. Like when we looked at understanding the Postgres 16 query planner, what's new, we realized it would need to have a whole introductory chapter that really talks about, well, what is the query planner, right? And how does it work and what's it about? And he wanted to just dive in and just talk about what's new and just have a few links to docs if people needed that background on what the query planner is or why it matters or whatever. So that's why we ended up picking, I think, number 13 on the list. And we also did some like Google Trends searches to understand, well, is it query planner or is it query optimizer? Like, which is the right word? What do people type into the search box? And that's why we compromised and included both. Because we found that like there was a lot, particularly I think people coming from other databases who might be wanting to learn more about Postgres, which is happening a lot. So we think about that, like how do we make this blog post make sense to an Oracle person, make sense to a MySQL person, or SQL Server person who's trying to build skills in Postgres. So anyway, that's kind of why we included both of those terms. But people will often just write down 2 or 3 titles, and they'll all be okay. But are they the title that is going to land on Front Page Hacker News? Just important to know, the first 60 characters are what show today on Google search results. It will truncate everything after that point. So the other thing that will sometimes happen is people will put the word Postgres like later, by character 75 or something like that. And that means it won't show up in Google search results. You're not going to get as many clicks. And over time, you're not going to perform as well. You want to say something or no? You're just nodding your head. Okay, cool. Feel free to dive in if you have comments. By the way, does anybody know how Google SEO is going to change? I'm curious. Oh, you want to say something else?
My comment is not really related to that. My comment's actually based on a previous slide, but I was kind of wondering how tones can be like condescending or arrogant within like when you write blog posts, right? Because I think that's something you mentioned like in an earlier slide. You're like, oh, should I check my tone? When I read it aloud, it's like I would never say something, right?
I will try to think if in the back of my mind while we're doing this of a good example of words that would have a condescending tone and see if I can give you one by the end of the talk.
Seems good. Thank you.
Is that cool?
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, boring versus interesting. All right, so other things you can do to optimize for SEO. And again, I think some of these things will still be true in a world where Gen AI is influencing search results, but I don't know that for sure. But one thing is just to avoid general terms like solution. Like solution can apply to weight loss solutions, right? It can apply to getting fit solutions. It's not necessarily about databases. So I try to make sure that my terms are just always very specific. Postgres, database, very narrowly focused that signal to the search engines what this thing is about. I do try to avoid pronouns. I debate that with people though, because if you avoid pronouns like it and this too much, then things can start to sound buzzwordy. Postgres, 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 Postgres. Like if I say Postgres 5 times in the same sentence, that does sound like buzzword bingo. So yeah, sometimes you probably do have to use pronouns, I admit it, but some people use them too much. And every time you use the word it or this, you have 2 negative side effects. One is that you literally stop the reader in their tracks. to try to figure out what that it is referring to. And oftentimes you don't realize your language is ambiguous, and it could be referring to this or referring to that, and they don't know. So they have to reread and reread to understand, because that's what they want. They want to understand. The second problem is, of course, you're losing all those opportunities to have that rich keyword in there, whether it's the query optimizer or streaming IO or whatever the rich keyword is. So the other thing too is for hyperlinks, a lot of just don't ever make the word here be the anchor text, the visible front text for a hyperlink that you're putting into your blog post. It's super helpful historically, and I don't know if this will still be true, but I suspect it will, that the anchor text, the visible text in front of the hyperlink, that it be specific, so that when someone clicks it and they go to that page, they're not surprised, right? Their expectations have been set as to where they're going. And that's just the kind of thing that Google's always prioritized. And so optimize for SEO. The other thing that we do in our team too, in addition to alt text for graphics, which is really important and does affect your SEO, we also paid attention to the bios. Google has had this program for years called EAT, Expertise, Authoritativeness, and Trustworthiness. And they literally, and again, I should check and see, is this going to go away in the future or will it persist? They'd hire humans. They'd go and check out and read blogs and look at that person's expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. And so we customized our bios on a lot of our blogs. I took these screenshots from the Citus blog, but they're probably quite similar on our other Microsoft blog. And we make sure that we put just descriptors in there that demonstrate that person's expertise, whether it's conference talks that they've spoken at, or their role in the Postgres community, or the company that they work for. But we also try to make it fun and human too. So we don't just want to have this be customized just to speak to the machine of Google, but also interesting to humans too. So, and there is debate. There was debate as to how much EAT, this Google program, affects SEO amongst all the SEO experts I know, but we did do it anyway because it's easy enough to do. You got to write a bio anyway. May as well write a good one. Okay, microphone.
This is partially covered with alt text, but you should also try to structure your page so that it's still readable without any styling, without any images, because that's what Google understands best. I mean, it's sophisticated enough to deal with those things, but if you write it in a way that is still readable and still makes sense, it will significantly help Google. And that can also apply to things like not linking here. So you might say, the sentence should still flow with the link removed. So you might say, you can find this, and then a link in the Postgres documentation, and make that a link. Instead, you can find this in the Postgres documentation here. That doesn't really make much sense if you strip everything away.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the reasons I'm not talking about how you structure your blogging platform and do what you're talking about is just because sometimes that's another person. Now, if it's your own personal blog and you own the platform and you're writing the blog, well, then you have to think about exactly what you just said. If, like on our team, we have to pass quarterly accessibility tests on our blogging platforms, on Tech Community and on the Citus blog, all of what you just described is tested. And so we do that. Thomas never has to think about it. He just knows that, so he has to focus on all the stuff that I am talking about. So, but it's a really, really good point. I just noticed I only have 11 minutes though, so I'm gonna keep moving on if I can. So we've talked a little bit about SEO, and then I have another set of checklists about mastering the edit cycle. So the slides will get published. But I wanna talk a little bit about distribution, which is disseminating your blog post to people and trying to make it possible for people to consume it. So, true or false question. We'll know which blog posts are good by how much traffic they get. True? Show of hands? Okay. False? Show of hands? Everybody's hands should go up for this, right? So yeah, a lot of it is distribution. Distribution and promotion trumps content. And I know from having given this talk at FOSDEM that I got a whole bunch of questions from people who were like really uncomfortable promoting their work. It just doesn't feel right. It feels braggy. It feels self-serving. It feels like advertising. And I just try to focus them on, wait a minute, you wrote this blog post to be useful to people, to help people, so that at 2 in the morning when they have a problem and they go to Google and try to find an answer to it, your blog shows up on the first page of search results. So, but if you don't ever promote it and share it and ask your friends to promote it and share it, it's not gonna solve that person's 2 in the morning problem. So we'll talk a little bit about promotion. One thing that we do is we do think about the graphic that goes along with it, the OG image, if you will. Different blogging platforms call it different things, teaser graphic, social graphic, OG image, which stands for open graph image. But we will try to find something that is visually interesting and also has some meaning, some connection. This is a very specific connection to a blog I wrote recently, but sometimes it's just a photograph. But there's, you know, the blog post is about migration and it's a photo of birds flying in the sky or whatever. I mean, as long as it's a cool photo of birds, that's fine. But the pro tip here is that before you actually publish and start sharing, to just double check what I call the unfurl, right? So you drop your link into any social platform. I use Slack to typically check the unfurls and just make sure that the HTML title, the HTML description, the OG image, everything is as you expect. Because several of these social platforms will cache, right? And so Twitter in particular would cache for 24 plus hours. So if you got it wrong and somebody had tweeted it, it doesn't matter that you fixed it. It's still gonna show the wrong graphic or the wrong description for a short period of time, which is a pain in the butt, but was the reality. There's also something called LinkedIn Post Inspector you can use because, you know, the whole social world is a bit fragmented these days, but a lot of people are actually using LinkedIn more. You all know about Planet Postgres, right? It's awesome, I love it. It's awesome as a consumer because I get to see all these different Postgres blogs on different topics, et cetera. But as a writer, as a blogger, like this particular blog that I wrote late last summer got like over 9,000 views of this tweet by being syndicated to Planet Postgres that it, you know, would not have gotten just with my promotion alone. So that was pretty awesome. And it's easy to get your blog registered there, and you just have to follow the policies. And if you don't, there are some draconian punishments. So you got to be careful to follow the policies. Like we all take it very seriously. So going to where your readers are, like look at all those channels that somebody has to think about. Now, sometimes my teammates come to me and they ask me to think about it, right? And I help them a lot with, okay, promotion. I'll drop on Reddit. I'll do a post here on Twitter. You need to do this. And we kind of divvy up the work. But unfortunately, the world is very fragmented these days. But there is still healthy conversation in a lot of these places. And it is a good way to reach more people and help them. The other thing that we'll sometimes do is I call it rinse, lather, repeat, but I will take the same blog post and I'll think about, okay, I tweeted it in the morning California time, but what about my European friends? And what about my New Zealand friends? I have 2 New Zealand friends. So, and you know, they're really active on Twitter. So actually, Thomas, you are. Like if I DM you on Twitter, I get a reply really fast. So, is that in the video? Shoot, I'm sorry. We'll have to delete that part. So, you know, think about time of day. And to my mind, it is okay to like repeat or reshare, especially if you're sharing that post from a different angle, right? You're saying something unique about it. You're not just repeating the same words over and over again, because that will get annoying, right? But hitting different times of day can help. The other thing that you can do is just like quote tweet. Or I forget, I guess we don't say tweet anymore, we say post. Quote post, right? So here I had posted something about a podcast interview and then, you know, another account quote posted it. And that caused a whole bunch more people who were not following me, but were following the other account to notice it. And so it's more powerful actually than a repost, if that makes sense. And that Azure database for Postgres in this case said something different or additive to the conversation. So there's all this philosophy and debate in the Mastodon world in particular about quote tweets and quote posts, and are they useful, and have people use them for like Machiavellian bad purposes, but they can be this very positive way to kind of keep something circulating and keep raising awareness. So that's another thing that we do for promotion. The other thing we do when we post on Reddit is Reddit frowns upon advertising. And how am I doing? Oh, I gotta keep going. All right, so we will make sure the author adds a comment to anytime we share a blog on Reddit, and both says something interesting and then invites Q&A. And as long as you're inviting Q&A, then that's considered by the moderators to be embracing the whole Reddit mindset. And so that was the secret recipe for not having your posts stricken from various subreddits for being advertising. And this is an example from a couple years ago. And it's a really cool example. I mean, it had 585 upvotes on the programming subreddit, which is freaking phenomenal. And it was because it was about open source. And the whole world, you know, in some sense, on that subreddit at least, likes open source. Karma's a two-way street. I'm often surprised. Everybody's so busy. But when one of your teammates writes something and publishes something, it's super nice to help promote it and to give it a +1, especially if they're a new blogger or if they're a more junior engineer or they're doing this for the first time. But the interesting thing about it is not only is it nice, but it does generate some karma, and they are more likely to help you when you go to publish something. So I believe it's an important part of teamwork, right? So when anybody on my team publishes anything interesting or anything good, I will share it and I will promote it. And people expect me to be sharing Postgres things, so that fits with like my whole brand online. Okay, so there's more promotion tips. I didn't fill in the promotion checklist because for everybody it's different, right? It depends on what your blog is about, where are you going to want to promote it, what are the right places for you to share it. So I couldn't fill that in for you, but at least I shared these various promotion tips. I already talked about checklists. Checklist Manifesto, Atul Gawande, great book recommendation. And if there is just one thing you remember from this talk, it is to have empathy for your readers. Because if you have that, and then that will motivate you to dig up the checklists or think about how can I help people understand at 2 in the morning, when they're really stressed, when they have a problem, when they're looking for answers. Okay, so before we leave, I have 3 quick things I want to show you, if you don't mind. Is that cool? And then we'll do questions at the very end. So one thing is I've been hosting this podcast that is called Path to CitusCon, and it's had over 15 episodes so far. And I'm just really curious, how many of you have heard of it? Okay, so almost half, but not quite. All right, the guests have been amazing, and I'll just put their faces up there. There are faces there that many of you, because you're part of the Postgres community, will recognize. You will definitely recognize at least one person on that list. And so I've been really blessed and honored that so many people have said yes when I've invited them to be on it. You can get to the index of all the episodes, and from there you can get to the subscribe thing, so if you're interested. The focus is on things like people's origin stories. How did they become expert in Postgres? What was their journey into Postgres benchmarking? In the case of Andres when he was on, and by the way, we got a lot of additional views when Andres became a famous person a couple months ago. People, and all these comments like, is this the same Andres that discovered the libc-utils bug? And so your topic was how I got started as a developer and in Postgres, right? So those are the kinds of topics. It's more the human side. But I actually think when you want to grow a community, it's helpful for people to understand where those that are here now came from. And the stories are so diverse and so different, the different paths that people have taken to end up working in open source and in Postgres. And of course, there was a special episode on PostGIS as well. So we're renaming the podcast. It's going to be called Talking Postgres instead of Path to CitusCon, because it is all about Postgres. So I'm very excited about the new name. I just got approval for it from the PGCI board a couple of weeks ago. And so we'll be rolling that out in the next month. And the new URL sort of works. I mean, it'll take you to the existing podcast with the existing name. So don't be surprised. All right, and this is telling me that I'm done. The other thing I just want to make sure, has anybody heard of POSET, an event for Postgres virtual conference coming up in June? Some of you have, Thomas is giving a talk. Thomas is giving a keynote. There are 4 keynotes, so that's very exciting. I just wanted you to know that the schedule is online if any of you want to check it out. And then finally, if any of you have just 3 minutes, you can scan that QR code with your camera. I have 3 questions on there that will help me in my work in the Postgres community. And if you answer those questions, I have really cool socks and activity books that I would be happy to trade you for if you fill out the survey. So thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. We did it. Awesome. Oh, I have credits and thank yous as well. All right, that's it. I'll get some socks out because I'm assuming somebody's going to fill out the survey, right? Oh, and you have a question.
I have a yes and. I was so excited that you posted up there Stephen King's On Writing. I have given feedback and to other engineers who are trying to break into open source to read On Writing and also Neil Gaiman's notes on the editing and feedback process.
Oh, cool.
And I think there's so much overlap between the professional writing process and the open source writing patches to be read and reviewed process that I think that if you do open source contribution, you owe it to yourself to read those.
Well, it's interesting. Melanie gave a talk, Melanie Plageman at PGConf.dev last fall, and Andres, maybe you remember the title of the talk, but it was about something about submitting patches and communicating with your committers and things like that. And as I watched the part of her talk I attended, I'm like, oh, this is a lot of the same things about communication that I talk about in this blogging talk. Question?
Oh, I just had a follow-up about condescending tone because I looked up the socials of the most condescending person I know and looked for some patterns, and he has a tendency to talk like, oh, most people aren't going to read this, but I am, things like that, where he just sort of makes it sound like he's this smarter than everyone else. So don't talk about how most people do this because they're just not informed or things like that.
Now I'm scared. Did I say most people during the talk? Okay. All right. Any other questions? Thank you. You all are a wonderful audience. Appreciate it.